You call 911 at 2:17 in the morning, and you tell them your husband fell down the stairs. You say he was drunk. You tell them to hurry. But when the paramedics show up, something feels wrong. The house is too quiet. There's no panic in your voice. The blood on the floor isn't fresh anymore. It's drying, darkening, and your husband's body is cold, too cold for someone who just fell. The doctors will tell his parents later that based on his body temperature and the condition of the blood, he was lying there for at least 3 hours before that call was made. 3 hours of bleeding, 3 hours of his brain swelling, 3 hours while you were somewhere in that house. His parents will ask the question everyone is thinking: where were you? What were you doing while their son was dying at the bottom of your stairs? This is the story of a man who didn't die but might never wake up, a wife who says it was an accident, parents who believe she let him suffer on purpose, and a truth that's locked inside the mind of someone who can't speak. So let me ask you this. If you found someone you loved unconscious and bleeding, how long would it take you to call for help? Seconds? A minute? Would you wait 3 hours? Because that's what happened here. And nobody can prove whether it was panic, confusion, or something much darker. Their names were Melissa and Connor, married for 6 years. From the outside, they seemed normal. Regular jobs, a house in the suburbs, the kind of couple you wouldn't look at twice. But people who knew them said things had been off for a while. Arguments about money, Connor drinking more than he used to, Melissa sleeping in the guest room most nights. Nothing crazy, just the usual stuff that happens when a marriage starts falling apart. But nobody thought it was dangerous. Nobody saw this coming. The night it happened, Connor had been out with his friends. They went to a sports bar, watched a game, had a few beers. His friends later told police he was tipsy when he left, but not wasted, not stumbling around. He was coherent enough to drive himself home, which he did. He made it back safely, pulled into the driveway, went inside, locked the door. What happened after that, nobody really knows. According to Melissa, she was asleep upstairs. She says she didn't hear him come home, didn't hear anything at all, until she woke up hours later, went downstairs to get water, and found him lying at the bottom of the stairs. She says she thought he had just passed out drunk. That's why she didn't immediately call 911. She thought he was sleeping it off. But here's where it gets weird. The stairs in their house aren't steep. They're carpeted. There's a railing on both sides. Connor had gone up and down those stairs thousands of times, even drunk, even in the dark. He knew that house. So how does a guy who's only moderately drunk fall down a set of carpeted stairs hard enough to crack his skull in 3 different places? Because that's what the medical examiner found. 3 separate impact points on Connor's head. Not 1, 3. Which means either he tumbled all the way down, hitting his head over and over, or something else caused those injuries. But there were no signs of a fight, no scratches, no bruises on his arms, no defensive wounds. The house was completely undisturbed. No broken furniture, no knocked over pictures, nothing. It looked exactly like a fall, except the timing didn't add up. When the first responders got there, they checked everything: his body temperature, the blood pattern, his breathing, his pupils, and they all noticed the same thing. This didn't just happen. The paramedic who examined him estimated Connor had been lying there for at least 3 hours, maybe longer. One of the paramedics asked Melissa directly, "When did you find him?" She said, "Just now, maybe 10 minutes before I called." He asked, "When did he fall?" She said, "I don't know. I was asleep." "Did you hear anything? A crash? Anything at all?" "No, I'm a deep sleeper. I didn't hear him come home. Didn't hear anything." The paramedic made a note of it, but didn't push further. There was no proof she was lying. But later he told investigators something felt off about her. She wasn't crying, wasn't hysterical. She just kept repeating that Connor was drunk, like she wanted everyone to remember that detail. Connor was rushed to the hospital, emergency surgery. They had to relieve pressure on his brain. His skull was fractured in multiple places, internal bleeding, swelling. The doctors did everything they could, but the damage was severe. He survived the surgery, but he didn't wake up. He slipped into a coma, and that's where he stayed. Days went by, then a week, then 2 weeks. Connor's parents, Robert and Diane, were at the hospital every single day. They sat beside his bed for hours, held his hand, talked to him, played his favorite music. They believed he could hear them. They believed he would wake up. Melissa visited too, but not as often. She told people it was too painful to see him like that she needed space to process what happened. Connor's parents didn't understand that. To them, if you loved someone, you showed up. You didn't leave them alone in a hospital bed. That's when Diane started asking questions. She started going over the timeline in her head. She started thinking about the layout of the house, the distance between the bedroom and the stairs, how loud a person falling downstairs would be, even on carpet. And she couldn't make it make sense. So she went to the police and said, "I don't think this was an accident. I think my daughter-in-law heard my son fall, and she didn't call for help. I think she waited, and I think she waited on purpose." The police had already closed the case. Accidental fall, no evidence of foul play. But when a victim's mother shows up saying she thinks it was intentional, they have to listen. So they reopened the investigation. They brought Melissa back in for questioning. They walked through the house again, measured everything, took photos, reviewed the 911 call recording, checked Melissa's phone, her computer, her bank accounts. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, friends. They built a timeline of that entire night, and they found nothing. No evidence that Melissa hurt Connor. No proof she even knew how badly injured he was when she found him. Yes, there was a delay, but that's not a crime. People freeze in emergencies. People make bad decisions under stress. The police couldn't charge her with anything because they couldn't prove intent. They couldn't prove she knew he was dying and chose not to help. So once again, the case was closed. Accidental fall. No charges filed. But Diane wasn't done. Diane hired a lawyer, then a private investigator. She started her own research, going through every detail of that night, every statement Melissa made, every piece of evidence the police collected. She wasn't just grieving, she was building a case. She gave interviews to local news stations. She started a blog documenting everything. She posted on forums asking for advice, asking if anyone else had been through something similar. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. And she wanted people to know that her son didn't just fall down the stairs. The private investigator she hired found a few interesting things, nothing that would hold up in court, but enough to make you wonder. For one, Melissa had been researching divorce lawyers in the weeks before Connor's fall. She'd visited 3 different websites, read articles about asset division, child custody, alimony. She and Connor didn't have kids, but she was clearly thinking about leaving. She'd also searched for information about life insurance policies, specifically how they pay out in cases of accidental death versus suicide versus natural causes. She'd looked up whether alcohol-related accidents were covered, whether a fall down the stairs would be considered accidental. Now, searching for information isn't proof of anything. People Google weird stuff all the time. Maybe she was just curious. Maybe she was planning for the future. Maybe it meant nothing. But when you combine it with what happened, it starts to paint a picture. The investigator also found out that Melissa and Connor had a fight the night before he went out with his friends. A neighbor heard yelling, heard something crash. The neighbor didn't call the police because it was just one incident and it stopped after a few minutes, but it happened, and Melissa never mentioned it to anyone. When the investigator asked her about it, she admitted they'd argued, but said it wasn't a big deal, just stress, money stuff, normal marriage problems. She said Connor had thrown a glass in frustration, not at her, just at the wall. She said they'd both cooled off and everything was fine by the next day. But was it? Diane didn't think so. She believed that fight was the beginning of something, that Melissa had reached a breaking point, that when Connor came home drunk that night, stumbling around, maybe they fought again, maybe something happened at the top of those stairs, maybe it wasn't a fall at all. But there was no proof, no witnesses, no evidence of a struggle, just suspicion and a mother's intuition. The investigator interviewed Connor's friends, the ones he'd been with that night. They all said the same thing. Connor wasn't that drunk. He was buzzed, sure, but he was walking fine, talking fine. He drove himself home, and they weren't even worried about it. If he'd been falling down drunk, they would have stopped him. They would have called him an Uber. So how does a guy who's only moderately drunk fall down the stairs with enough force to fracture his skull in 3 places? The investigator brought in a biomechanics expert, someone who studies how injuries happen. The expert looked at the photos of the staircase, the measurements, the autopsy report, and he said it was possible for someone to fall and sustain those injuries, but it would require a very specific set of circumstances. The person would have to trip near the top, lose their balance completely, tumble head first, and hit their head on multiple edges on the way down. It's possible, but unlikely. The expert also said the injuries were consistent with being pushed, not definite, not proof, but consistent. If someone had shoved Connor from behind at the top of the stairs and he'd fallen forward without catching himself, the injuries would look almost identical. Diane took all of this information and tried to get the district attorney to reopen the case. She presented everything: the searches on Melissa's computer, the fight the night before, the expert's opinion, the inconsistencies in Melissa's story. The DA reviewed it all and said, "No, there's not enough here. Everything you have is circumstantial. We can't prove she pushed him. We can't even prove she was awake when he fell. And we definitely can't prove she intentionally delayed calling 911. Without physical evidence or a witness, there's no case." Diane was devastated. She felt like the system had failed her son. She felt like Melissa was getting away with something, and there was nothing she could do about it. But then something happened that changed everything. Connor moved. It was small, just his fingers. Diane was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand like she did every day, talking to him about memories from when he was a kid, and his fingers twitched, just once, but she saw it. She called the nurse immediately. The nurse checked his vitals, checked his reflexes, ran some tests, and she said it was probably just an involuntary muscle spasm. It happens with coma patients. It doesn't mean he's waking up. But Diane didn't believe that. She started paying closer attention. She started talking to him more, asking him yes or no questions, telling him to squeeze her hand if he could hear her. And over the next few days, it happened again. Small movements, a finger twitch, a slight change in his breathing. Once his eyelids fluttered. The doctors said it was all involuntary. They said coma patients sometimes have these responses, but they're not conscious, they're not aware. It's just the brain firing random signals. But Diane noticed something else. When Melissa visited and spoke to Connor, his heart rate would spike, the monitors would beep, his breathing would change. It happened multiple times, enough that the nurses started noticing it too. One nurse mentioned it to a doctor. The doctor said it could be a stress response, that even in a coma, the brain can sometimes react to familiar voices, especially if those voices are associated with strong emotions. Diane believed it was more than that. She believed Connor could hear what was happening around him. She believed he was trying to communicate, and she believed his body was reacting to Melissa because on some level he remembered what happened that night. She started recording the monitor readings whenever Melissa visited. She documented every spike, every change, every reaction. She was building evidence again, but this time evidence that Connor himself was providing. The experts started to notice the tension between Melissa and Diane. It was hard to miss. Diane would be sitting beside Connor's bed, and Melissa would walk in, and the temperature in the room would drop. They barely spoke to each other. When they did, it was cold, polite on the surface, but you could feel the anger underneath. Diane accused Melissa of not caring, of only showing up when other people were around to see her, of playing the grieving wife for sympathy while doing the bare minimum. Melissa shot back that Diane was harassing her, that she was grieving too and didn't need to be judged for how she processed it, that Diane was making an already horrible situation worse by spreading lies and accusations. The hospital staff tried to stay neutral, but some of them sided with Diane. Some of the nurses had been there since day one. They'd seen Melissa's reaction when Connor first came in. They'd seen how calm she was, how she didn't cry, how she kept her distance. And yeah, people grieve differently, but there was something off about it. One nurse told Diane privately that she believed her. She said she'd been working in critical care for 15 years, and she'd seen a lot of spouses in crisis, and Melissa didn't act like the others. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't praying. She wasn't begging the doctors to do more. She just seemed resigned, like she'd already accepted he was gone. But believing something and proving it are two different things. Diane kept documenting Connor's reactions. She started bringing in different people to see if his vitals changed with other visitors. When his father visited, no change. When his brother came, no change. When his best friend showed up, slight change, but nothing dramatic. But every single time Melissa walked into that room, Connor's heart rate spiked. His breathing quickened. The monitors lit up. Diane took all of this to a neurologist who specialized in coma patients. She asked if it was possible for someone in a coma to recognize specific people and react to them. The neurologist said yes, it's possible. The brain is complicated. Even in a deep coma, some patients retain a level of awareness. They can't communicate, they can't move on command, but some part of them is still processing information. She asked if a patient could react differently to someone they were afraid of. The neurologist paused, then said theoretically yes. If the patient had a traumatic association with a person, their body might respond with a stress reaction, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension. It's a survival instinct. The body remembers danger even when the mind can't articulate it. Diane asked if that could be used as evidence. The neurologist said absolutely not. It's not reliable. It's not scientifically conclusive. A lawyer would tear it apart in seconds. But off the record, between just the two of them, the neurologist said if it were her son, she'd trust her gut. Diane's gut was screaming that Connor was afraid of Melissa, that his body knew something his brain couldn't say. She went back to the DA, showed him the documentation, the heart rate spikes, the neurologist's explanation. She begged him to look at the case again. She said Connor is trying to tell us what happened, and we're not listening. The DA sympathized, he really did, but he said this isn't evidence. This is a mother who's desperate for answers, and I understand that, but I can't build a case on heart rate monitors. Defense would argue it's coincidence. They'd argue it's trauma response to any visitor. They'd bring in their own expert to say it means nothing, and they'd be right. This doesn't prove anything. Diane left that meeting feeling hopeless. She tried everything, hired investigators, consulted experts, documented every detail, and none of it mattered because Connor couldn't speak. He couldn't point at Melissa and say she did this. He couldn't tell anyone what really happened that night. And legally, Melissa had done nothing wrong. Months passed. Connor remained in a coma. His condition stabilized but didn't improve. The doctors started talking about long-term care facilities. They said he could stay like this for years, maybe forever. The brain damage was too severe. The chances of him waking up were slim to none. Melissa started talking about moving him to a facility. She said keeping him in the hospital was expensive and unnecessary, that he'd be more comfortable somewhere designed for long-term patients. Diane fought her on it. She wanted Connor close. She wanted to be able to visit him every day. She didn't trust Melissa to make decisions about his care. They ended up in court, a hearing to determine who had medical power of attorney. Melissa was his wife, so legally she had the right. But Diane argued that Melissa had a conflict of interest, that she might not have Connor's best interests at heart, that she might even want him to die so she could move on with her life. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the medical records, heard from the doctors, and ruled in Melissa's favor. She was his wife. She had the legal right to make medical decisions. Diane's accusations were serious, but they were unproven. Without evidence of wrongdoing, the judge couldn't strip Melissa of her rights. Diane was crushed. She felt like she was losing her son all over again. But she didn't stop visiting. Every single day she was there, talking to him, playing music, reading him books. She refused to give up. She refused to believe he was gone. And then, almost 6 months after the fall, something happened that nobody expected. Connor opened his eyes. It was brief, just a few seconds, but the nurse saw it. She called the doctor immediately. They ran tests, checked his brain activity, and they found changes. Small changes, but changes. His brain was showing more activity than before. He wasn't fully awake, but he wasn't as deep in the coma as he had been. The doctors called it emerging consciousness. They said it didn't mean he'd fully recover. He might never speak, might never walk, might never be the person he was before, but some part of him was coming back. Diane was there when it happened. She was holding his hand, telling him about a fishing trip they'd taken when he was 12, and his eyes opened, just for a moment, and he looked at her, really looked at her. Then they closed again. She started crying. She called Robert. She called Connor's brother. She told everyone he was waking up. He was coming back. Melissa was notified too. She came to the hospital that evening, walked into the room, and Connor's heart rate spiked so high the nurse had to check the equipment to make sure it wasn't malfunctioning. The doctor said Connor's brain was doing something they didn't fully understand. He wasn't consistently conscious, but he was having moments, brief windows where he seemed aware. His eyes would open. Sometimes he'd move his hand. Once he made a sound, not a word, just a groan, but it was intentional. He was trying. Diane was there for all of it. She barely left his side. She talked to him constantly, asking him questions, telling him he was safe, that she was there, that he could take his time. She believed he was fighting to come back, fighting to tell everyone what really happened. Melissa's visits became less frequent. She said it was too hard to see him like this, stuck between worlds, neither awake nor fully gone. She said it felt like torture. But Diane thought differently. She thought Melissa was scared, scared that Connor might actually wake up, scared of what he might say. The medical team started doing cognitive tests, simple things. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Blink once for yes, twice for no. Most of the time, Connor didn't respond, but sometimes he did. It was inconsistent, but it was something. One afternoon, a neurologist asked Connor if he knew where he was. No response. Asked if he knew his name. No response. Asked if he could hear them. His eyes moved, focused on the doctor, and he blinked once. The room went silent. The doctor asked again, "Can you hear me?" One blink. Yes. Diane started sobbing. She grabbed his hand and said, "Connor, it's Mom. I'm here. You're gonna be okay." Connor's eyes shifted to her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes closed again, and he was gone, back into that foggy in-between place. But it was progress, real progress. The doctor said it would be a long road, months, maybe years of rehabilitation if he continued to improve. They said his speech might never fully return. His motor skills might be permanently damaged, but he was showing signs of awareness, and that was more than they'd expected. Diane immediately called the detective who'd worked the case. She said, "Connor is waking up. He's communicating. You need to talk to him. You need to ask him what happened." The detective was hesitant. He said, "Connor's not a reliable witness right now. He's barely conscious. A defense attorney would destroy anything he says. They'd argue he's confused, medicated, brain damaged. They'd say his memory is compromised. Even if he says Melissa pushed him, it won't hold up in court." Diane didn't care about court. She just wanted the truth. But the detective had a point. Legally, they needed more. They needed Connor to be coherent, consistent. They needed him to be able to testify, and right now he couldn't. So they waited. Weeks went by. Connor's moments of awareness became more frequent. He started responding to commands more reliably. Squeeze my hand, move your foot, open your eyes. He couldn't speak yet, but he was trying. His mouth would move like he was forming words, but no sound came out. The speech therapist said his vocal cords were damaged. Between the intubation and the trauma, it was going to take time, but she was optimistic. She thought he'd eventually regain some speech. Diane asked the therapist if they could try a communication board, something with letters or words that Connor could point to. The therapist said they could try, but his fine motor skills weren't there yet. He could barely lift his hand. Pointing accurately would be impossible. But they tried anyway. They set up a board with simple words: yes, no, help, pain, tired, thirsty, and they asked Connor to try to point. He stared at the board. His hand twitched. He was trying. You could see the effort in his face, but his hand wouldn't cooperate. It shook, moved in the wrong direction. He got frustrated. You could see it in his eyes. Diane held his hand and said, "It's okay. You're doing great. We'll keep trying." But Connor's eyes filled with tears, and that broke her, because it meant he was aware. He knew what was happening to him. He knew he couldn't communicate. He was trapped inside his own body, desperate to speak, and the words wouldn't come. The therapist suggested eye-tracking technology, a computer that could follow his eye movements and allow him to select letters or words on a screen. It was expensive, but Diane didn't care. She'd pay anything. She started a fundraiser online, shared Connor's story, asked for help. The community responded. Within a week, they'd raised enough to get the equipment. It took time to set up, time to calibrate, time for Connor to learn how to use it. But slowly he got the hang of it. He could look at a letter, hold his gaze, and the computer would select it. It was slow, exhausting for him, but it worked. The first word he spelled out was M-O-M. Diane lost it. She hugged him as carefully as she could and told him she loved him, that she never gave up, that she knew he'd come back. The second word he spelled was H-U-R-T-S. She asked where. He spelled H-E-A-D. She told the nurse. They adjusted his pain medication. Over the next few days, Connor started spelling more, short phrases: tired, thirsty, thank you. He was communicating. It was basic, but it was real. And then Diane asked the question she'd been waiting months to ask. She leaned in close and said, "Connor, do you remember what happened the night you fell?" He stared at the screen. His eyes moved slowly, selecting letters. U-A-S. Diane's heart pounded. She said, "Can you tell me?" Connor's eyes moved again. It took a long time. Each letter required so much focus, but he kept going. F-E-L-L. Diane waited. "Is that all? Did you just fall?" Connor's eyes moved again. N-O. Diane felt her breath catch. She said, "What happened?" Connor looked at the screen. His eyes were tired. This was taking everything he had, but he kept going. P-U-S-H. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. She said, "Someone pushed you?" U-E-S. She said, "Who? Who pushed you?" Connor stared at the screen. His eyes filled with tears again. He looked at his mother, and then he looked back at the screen. He started spelling. M-E-L. He stopped, too exhausted to continue, but he didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew what he was trying to say. Melissa. Diane immediately called the detective. She was shaking, barely able to get the words out. "He's awake. He's talking. He said Melissa pushed him." The detective said he'd come to the hospital right away. Within an hour, he was there. He brought another detective with him. They asked to speak with Connor privately, but Diane refused to leave. This was her son. She'd fought for months to get to this point. She wasn't going anywhere. The detective agreed. He pulled up a chair next to Connor's bed and said, "Connor, I'm Detective Harris. We met briefly after your accident, but you weren't conscious then. I need to ask you some questions about what happened that night. If you get tired, we can stop. Just let me know. Can you do that?" Connor looked at the screen. U-E-S. The detective said, "Do you remember the night you were injured?" U-E-S. "Do you remember coming home that night?" U-E-S. "Were you drunk?" Connor hesitated, then spelled N-O-T-V-E-R-Y. The detective made a note. He said, "Were you and Melissa fighting that night?" Connor's eyes moved to the screen. U-E-S. "What were you fighting about?" This took longer. Connor's eyes kept closing. He was exhausted, but he kept pushing through. M-O-N-E-Y. D-I-V-O-R-C-E. The detective said Melissa wanted a divorce? U-E-S. "And you didn't?" Connor paused, then spelled, "It's complicated." The detective said, "Take your time. I need to understand what happened. You came home, you and Melissa were fighting, then what?" Connor's eyes were struggling to stay open, but he kept going. S-T-A-I-R-S. A-R-G-U-I-N-G. She pushed... The detective leaned forward. "She pushed you down the stairs?" U-E-S.
Did she mean to hurt you, or was it an accident? Like, did she shove you in anger and you lost your balance? Connor stared at the screen. His breathing was getting heavier. This was too much for him. But he spelled out 2 more letters. H-A-R-D. The detective said, "She pushed you hard?" Y-E-S. "On purpose?" Y-E-S. Connor's eyes closed. He was done. The nurse stepped in and said, "That's enough. He needs to rest. You can come back tomorrow." But the detective had what he needed. He had a victim willing to testify that his wife pushed him down the stairs intentionally. He left the hospital and went straight to the district attorney, showed him the recording he'd made of the conversation, explained that Connor was using eye-tracking technology to communicate, that he was clear, consistent, and credible. The DA watched the video, then said, "This is good, but I need more. I need to make sure Connor is mentally competent. I need a neurologist to evaluate him and confirm that he understands what he's saying, that his memory is reliable, that he's not confused or influenced, and I need him to be able to maintain this story over time. One conversation isn't enough. If we charge Melissa and this goes to trial, Connor will have to testify. Defense will bring in experts to say his brain is damaged, his memory is false, he's been manipulated by his mother. We need to be rock solid." The detective agreed. Over the next few weeks, Connor was evaluated by multiple specialists, neurologists, psychiatrists, forensic psychologists. They all asked him the same questions in different ways, and every single time, his story stayed the same. He and Melissa had been fighting about money and divorce. She wanted out. He didn't want to split assets, didn't want to lose the house. The argument escalated. He started walking away, heading upstairs to cool off. She followed him. They were at the top of the stairs, still yelling, and then she put both hands on his back and shoved. Hard. He didn't have time to grab the railing. He went head first down the stairs, hit his head multiple times, blacked out. The next thing he remembered was waking up in the hospital, unable to move or speak. One of the psychologists asked if Melissa thought 911 right away. Connor spelled N-O, said he had a vague memory of hearing her voice, hearing her walking around, but not hearing panic, not hearing her call for help. He thought she left him there. The psychologist asked how he knew that if he was unconscious. Connor said he didn't know, just a feeling, pieces of memory that didn't make sense. But the important part was consistent. Melissa pushed him. It wasn't an accident. The DA finally had enough. He filed charges. Attempted murder.
When the police showed up at Melissa's door with an arrest warrant, she didn't seem surprised. She didn't cry, didn't shout, just asked if she could grab her purse. They read her rights, cuffed her, put her in the back of a police car. Neighbors watched from their windows. Some of them filmed it. By that evening, it was all over local news. Woman arrested for attempted murder of husband 6 months after staircase incident. Melissa's mugshot was everywhere. She looked tired, empty, like she'd been expecting this. She posted bail the next day, hired a defense attorney, and then she did something nobody expected. She gave an interview. She sat down with a local news reporter and said, "I didn't push my husband. I would never hurt him. He's confused. His brain is damaged. He doesn't remember what really happened, and his mother has been poisoning his mind against me for months." The reporter asked if Melissa was lying. Melissa said, "I don't think he's lying. I think he believes what he's saying. But memory doesn't work like that, especially after a traumatic brain injury. The brain fills in gaps, creates narratives. He's been surrounded by people telling him, 'I did this,' so now he believes it, but it's not real." The reporter asked what really happened. Melissa said exactly what I told the police from the beginning. He came home drunk, he fell, I found him and called 911. That's the truth. But the evidence said otherwise. The trial started 8 months after Connor's fall. By that point, he'd regained some ability to speak. Not much. His words were slurred. Sometimes he couldn't find the right ones, but he could communicate enough to testify. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Connor said Melissa pushed him. His injuries were consistent with being pushed. Melissa had motive because she wanted a divorce and didn't want to split assets, didn't want to lose the house. The argument escalated. He started walking away, heading upstairs to cool off. She followed him. They were at the top of the stairs, still yelling, and then she put both hands on his back and shoved, hard. He didn't have time to grab the railing. He went head first down the stairs, hit his head multiple times, blacked out. The next thing he remembered was waking up in the hospital, unable to move or speak. One of the psychologists asked if Melissa thought 911 right away. Connor spelled N-O, said he had a vague memory of hearing her voice, hearing her walking around, but not hearing panic, not hearing her call for help. He thought she left him there. The psychologist asked how he knew that if he was unconscious. Connor said he didn't know, just a feeling, pieces of memory that didn't make sense. But the important part was consistent. Melissa pushed him. It wasn't an accident. The DA finally had enough. He filed charges, attempted murder. The defense's case was equally straightforward. Connor's brain was damaged. His memory couldn't be trusted. There was no physical evidence that Melissa pushed him, no witnesses, no forensics, just the word of a man whose skull had been cracked open and whose brain had been swelling for hours before he got medical treatment. The defense brought in neurologists who testified that traumatic brain injury patients often have false memories, that the brain, desperate to make sense of trauma, will create stories that feel real but aren't. They said Connor had been surrounded by his mother, who repeatedly told him Melissa was responsible, and over time he internalized that narrative. They pointed out that in the first few weeks after Connor woke up, he didn't accuse Melissa of anything. It was only after months of his mother's influence that he started saying she pushed him. The prosecution countered that Connor couldn't communicate in those early weeks. He didn't have the ability to tell anyone what happened. Once he had the tools to speak, he immediately said Melissa pushed him. That's not false memory. That's the truth finally coming out. The defense brought in neurologists who testified that traumatic brain injury patients often have false memories, that the brain, desperate to make sense of trauma, will create stories that feel real but aren't. They said Connor had been surrounded by his mother, who repeatedly told him Melissa was responsible, and over time he internalized that narrative. They pointed out that in the first few weeks after Connor woke up, he didn't accuse Melissa of anything. It was only after months of his mother's influence that he started saying she pushed him. The prosecution countered that Connor couldn't communicate in those early weeks. He didn't have the ability to tell anyone what happened. Once he had the tools to speak, he immediately said Melissa pushed him. That's not false memory. That's the truth finally coming out. The defense brought in a biomechanics expert who testified that Connor's injuries were entirely consistent with a fall, that you don't need to be pushed to sustain multiple head impacts. A drunk person losing their balance at the top of the stairs could absolutely tumble down and hit their head 3 times. The prosecution brought in their own expert who said while a fall is possible, the force required to cause that much damage suggests an external push, especially given that Connor wasn't heavily intoxicated. The jury heard from Connor's friends who said he wasn't that drunk when he left the bar. They heard from the paramedics who said the scene felt off. They heard from the neighbors who said they'd heard fighting coming from the house. And they heard from Connor himself. He took the stand, which was difficult for him. He was in a wheelchair. His speech was slow and hard to understand. But he told his story, said Melissa pushed him, said it wasn't an accident, said she wanted him gone. The defense attorney cross-examined him, asked about his memory, asked if he remembered every detail of that night. Connor admitted there were gaps, things he couldn't remember. The attorney asked if it was possible he'd fallen, and his brain, trying to make sense of the trauma, created the memory of being pushed. Connor said no, he knew what happened. The attorney asked if his mother had visited him every day, if she'd talked to him about Melissa, if she'd told him she thought Melissa was responsible. Connor said yes, but that didn't change what he remembered. The attorney asked if it was possible his mother had influenced his memory. Connor got frustrated, said he knew what happened. Nobody put that in his head. It was real. But the defense had planted doubt, and in a criminal trial, doubt is everything. Melissa testified too. She cried on the stand, said she loved Connor, said she would never hurt him, said the night he fell was the worst night of her life. She admitted they'd been having problems, admitted she'd thought about divorce, but said thinking about something isn't the same as acting on it. She said when she found Connor at the bottom of the stairs, she panicked. She didn't know what to do. She thought he was just drunk and passed out. She didn't realize how badly he was hurt until she got closer and saw the blood. Then she called 911 immediately. The prosecution asked why she waited 3 hours. Melissa said she didn't. She said she found him and called within minutes. The prosecution showed her the timeline, the medical examiner's report, the evidence that Connor had been lying there for hours. Melissa broke down, said she didn't know. Maybe she was in shock, maybe time felt different, but she didn't wait on purpose. The prosecution asked about her internet searches, the divorce lawyers, the life insurance. Melissa said she was exploring her options. That doesn't make her a murderer. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 days, and they came back with a verdict: not guilty. The prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Melissa pushed Connor. The jury believed Connor's memory could be unreliable. They believed the fall could have been an accident, and without physical evidence, without witnesses, they couldn't convict. Diane collapsed in the courtroom. She sobbed, screamed, had to be escorted out. She couldn't believe it. Her son had told the truth, and nobody believed him. Connor sat in his wheelchair, staring at nothing. He didn't cry, didn't react, just stared. Melissa walked out of the courthouse a free woman. Cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions. She didn't say anything, just got in a car and left. The case was over. Legally, it was an accident. Melissa was innocent. But the public didn't see it that way. The trial had been all over the news. People had opinions. Social media exploded. Some people believed Connor. Some people believed Melissa. It split down the middle. Melissa's life fell apart anyway. She lost her job, lost her friends. People recognized her everywhere she went. She couldn't go to the grocery store without someone staring. She moved to a different state, changed her name, tried to disappear. Connor continued his rehabilitation. Slowly, painfully, he learned to walk again. His speech improved, but never fully recovered. He'd never be the person he was before. Diane never forgave Melissa, never stopped believing her son. She spent the rest of her life telling anyone who'd listen that Melissa got away with attempted murder. And Connor? He stuck to his story, never changed it, never wavered, said until the day he died, Melissa pushed him. Whether you believe him or not, that's up to you. So what really happened that night? Did Melissa push Connor down those stairs, wait for him to die, then call 911 when she realized he might survive and tell everyone what she did? Or did Connor fall, suffer brain damage, and create a false memory influenced by his mother's accusations? We'll probably never know for sure. The jury said not guilty, but that doesn't mean innocent. It just means there wasn't enough proof. Connor believes his wife tried to kill him. He's lived with that belief every day since he woke up. Whether it's a real memory or something his damaged brain constructed, to him it's the truth. Melissa maintains she's innocent, that she's a victim too, a victim of a terrible accident and a vindictive mother-in-law who destroyed her life. And Diane will go to her grave believing her son was almost murdered and the person who did it walked free. 3 people, 3 versions of the same night, and the only fact everyone agrees on is that Connor fell down those stairs and almost died. The rest is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of something that might not have an answer. Maybe that's the scariest part, not knowing. Living in that gray area where the truth is just out of reach, locked inside a moment that only 2 people witnessed, and one of them can't fully remember, and the other swears it never happened the way he says it did. So I'll leave you with this. If you were on that jury, what would you have decided? Would you believe Connor? Would you believe Melissa? Or would you sit there, staring at the evidence, and realize you just don't know? Drop your thoughts in the comments.